If you're listening to this while still deep in the corporate grind and you worry about purpose in your life, then I hope this episode gives you a bit of air. A lot of people who are chasing financial independence or who are just stuck in jobs that they don't particularly love, they're carrying a secret in the background, even if they never say it out loud. That secret is, once I quit, then I'll figure out purpose. Once I'm free, then life will make sense. That belief is not coming from laziness or intentional avoidance. It comes from exhaustion. When work takes most of your energy, attention, and emotional bandwidth, it's really hard to imagine building anything meaningful alongside it. So, naturally, we defer it. We park purpose in the future and tell ourselves we'll deal with it once we've earned the right to rest. I believe that too for a long time. But my more recent, slightly hard-won view is that avoidance doesn't soothe the anxiety that you feel. It actually feeds it and unsteadies you. Waiting to feel ready often makes the unease feel heavier, not lighter. So today, instead of postponing the question again, let's try and do the opposite and look at it head on. You've built the career, you're building the portfolio, you're close to freedom. So what now? Welcome to Life After Enough, money, meaning, and the life you design when work becomes optional. I'm Nick. I'm racing towards early retirement and figuring out who I become when the job no longer dictates what I do with my time. Let's get into it. I'm recording this from Singapore at the end of a busy work week. It's early morning. The city is still quiet, which has always been my favorite moment of the day. There's something about Saturdays that just tends to soften everything. No alarms, no urgency, and for a few hours at least, life feels like it belongs to you again, not your calendar or your inbox. And in moments like this, it's when the contrast is really sharp and a fantasy creeps in. Because when work starts to feel a bit misaligned and you get that low-level persistent niggle that you can't quite name, a very seductive escape story begins to form. I know it well because I've lived it. The story usually goes something like this. Once I hit my number, once I step away, once the pressure lifts, then clarity will just arrive. Motivation will return, and I'll finally feel like myself again. On her podcast, Afford Anything, Paula Pant talks a lot about the idea that money doesn't actually buy happiness, and instead it buys options. And one of the biggest options most of us are really chasing isn't luxury or status. It's simply space. Whether that's mental space, emotional space, or that elusive room to breathe, it's natural then to assume that once we buy that space with our fire pot of gold, that purpose will naturally flow in and fill it. But what I've started to notice in myself and in others who've reached financial independence already and are living the FIRE dream is that when structure disappears overnight, purpose almost never rushes in to replace it. It's mischievous, it hesitates, and it's quieter than expected. Sometimes it doesn't even show up at all. Which is why I think the escape fantasy is better described as an escape fallacy. Leaving the corporate grind doesn't magically solve what feels unresolved. Freedom in itself doesn't automatically soothe anxiety. Those things only ease when you start facing them head on before you jump. So what happens when work actually stops? Work doesn't just take time from us. It also gives us things, whether we like it or not. And those are things that society values and is built around. Rhythm, urgency, a reason to get up in the morning, a sense of progress and validation. So, when you step away from work and remove all of that, what people are often most surprised about isn't boredom, but it's disorientation. Oliver Burkeman writes in 4,000 Weeks that modern work gives us a kind of false structure for life. We complain about it constantly, but when it's gone, we realize how much of our identity and momentum were quietly attached to it. And that's why waiting until you quit to look for purpose can feel harder than expected. You're suddenly free, but you're unanchored. By avoiding the work during the journey and building your purpose finding muscle, you run the risk of falling right back into your old job again 6 months later. And this also shows up in the infamous 1 more year problem. On the surface, 1 more year looks like a purely financial decision. You stay working in the job to get 1 more bonus, 1 more year of buffer saved, 1 more year of certainty. But underneath is usually not about money at all. It's about fear. More specifically, it's about not trusting that there's anything solid waiting for you on the other side of work. When work is the only place you feel useful and relevant or structured, leaving it feels less like freedom and more like a free fall. So staying becomes the safer default option. What purpose does before you quit is alter that equation. It gives you evidence that you can create meaning without a job title, that you can generate momentum without corporate urgency, and that your life doesn't collapse when work stops being the center of your universe. That's why the small things matter so much. Helping my parents build their home, training consistently, starting this podcast without knowing where it will go. None of those were escape plans, and none of them replaced work, but they reduced how much emotional weight work was carrying. And that's the difference. When purpose exists alongside work, you're no longer asking, can I survive without this? You're asking, do I still need this in the same way? That's why those who build purpose before quitting are far less likely to get stuck in the 1 more year loops. They're not leaping into the unknown anymore. They're just stepping into something already partially built. And there was a moment in my own journey that changed how I think about purpose. Interestingly, it wasn't when I hit my original FIRE number. It wasn't even when I took my glorious sabbatical. It came much earlier than that. It was when I helped my parents build their dream home. What struck me at the time was how little had changed on the surface. I was working the same job, the same hours with the same stresses and grind, but suddenly work felt different. For the first time in my personal FIRE journey, I could see very clearly how money could positively impact the people I love. And this was not in some abstract future tense way, but right here, today, in real time. I loved receiving all of the progress pictures on the house and seeing how much joy it was giving to my parents. For the first time since I discovered FIRE, work stopped being something I was enduring for my own escape, and it became something that was serving a wider story. I still didn't love every single day, but the days stopped feeling hollow. And then this popped up again later during the messy middle of my sabbatical. Once the novelty wore off and the travel slowed down, once the big life events like getting married were over, I did have a wobble, a proper existential one. And in that time, purpose didn't arrive as some grand revelation. It showed up in really unexpected ways. In the morning boot camp I started going to, in moving the body, and in showing up consistently, and in building this podcast, piece by piece, without knowing exactly where it would go. Tiny, small things, ordinary things, but they grounded me. And that's when it really clicked. Purpose doesn't have to replace work. For most of us, it just needs to sit alongside it. Quick one before we continue. I send a weekly email every Monday morning that goes deeper than the podcast. It's not a recap, it's a separate idea, usually something more personal, plus a question to sit with for the week. It's free, it's one email, and you can sign up at lifeafterenough.com. Link is in the show notes. Okay, back to it. We often think about purpose like it's supposed to arrive in this big, fully formed moment, a calling, a mission, a dramatic second act that only shows up once you quit. But when you're still in the grind, purpose usually works in a much more opaque way. And this is where it's different from identity. Identity is about who you are becoming over time, where purpose, especially at this stage, is much lighter than that. It's not who you are, but it's something more like what you can touch. The beauty of purpose, when you're still working, is that it acts like a pressure relief valve, something you can mentally return to give reassurance that my life isn't on hold. This isn't just waiting time, and I'm already moving. For me, this has been this podcast, not as a big grand project, not as a future career even, just as something real I could show up to consistently. The notion of finding purpose can actually be harder after you quit. This is the slightly counterintuitive part. A lot of us assume that purpose will be easier once you're free from the shackles of corporate life, where the pressure lifts and time opens up. But in practice, an abundance of freedom often removes something else as well: urgency. And urgency, for better or for worse, creates momentum. Think of it this way. When life still has sharp edges, a job, a schedule, time constraints, purpose doesn't have to be perfect. All it has to do in that context is to simply exist somewhere alongside everything else that you do. There's friction there, of course, but there's also structure. Small purpose experiments fit more easily into a life that already has shape. Once everything opens up, however, the questions get much, much bigger, much, much scarier, and much more existential. What on earth are you going to do with all this time and space? And I think that's why so many people drift after quitting or rush to fill the silence with another big, grand project. Not because they necessarily love it, but because productivity still feels safer than emptiness. Viktor Frankl wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that meaning doesn't come from comfort or from ease. It actually comes from engagement, from choosing something to care about. And that choice usually starts before life gets simple. His insights map uncannily well into everything we're talking about in this episode. Removing discomfort, such as quitting work or hitting your fire number, doesn't automatically create meaning. In fact, too much comfort can expose a lack of engagement. Meaning requires choice, commitment, and care, not just freedom. And that's why people drift post-fire. Purpose feels oddly harder after quitting, and small commitments before freedom are so stabilizing. They're all acts of engagement and not identity replacement. There's another way people try and solve the purpose problem. Instead of sitting down, thinking about it, and asking, what actually matters to me? Or what do I want out of life next? They accept the next default milestone, whatever life, culture, or work puts in front of them. That could be marriage. It could be kids. Buy a bigger house. Buy a bigger car. Take that next promotion at work. And this doesn't happen just in life. It happens constantly in the corporate environment as well. At work, there's a very clear script. If you're capable, you should want the promotion. If you're ambitious, you should say yes to more scope. If you don't want the next rung, maybe something is wrong. Not wanting your boss's life really does raise eyebrows. Pausing progression gets interpreted as a lack of drive. Saying, this is enough for me for now, can somehow mark you as less committed, even when the organization was happy to promote you in the first place, which is wild when you think about it. Often, what you're really saying isn't, I don't care. It's, I'm thinking. The same dynamic plays out in personal life. For a lot of my straight friends, especially after they get married, parenthood isn't just an option. It's assumed and it's expected. It's just what comes next. It's what you do and it's how life progresses. And there's often judgment if you don't follow that script. Judgment that, in my view, is completely unwarranted. And to be clear, this is not an anti-kids take here. I love kids and I'm seriously considering parenthood myself. Parenthood can be deeply meaningful, grounding, and beautiful. But sometimes people don't choose it, they just arrive at it. Especially when work no longer fulfills them, or fire feels distant or destabilizing. And the question of what now starts to feel loud. In that moment, kids or the big promotion at work can feel like instant purpose, instant structure, instant meaning, instant justification for staying exactly where you are. It answers a lot of questions very quickly, but it also closes doors just as fast. And if the decision is driven by, I don't know what else would give my life meaning, rather than, I deeply want this life, that's a very different starting point. One of the risks of postponing purpose work is that you outsource it. You outsource it to these life events, or to work by climbing the corporate ladder, to biology or social expectation, or to fear of emptiness. And again, sometimes that will work out beautifully for people, but sometimes it leads to resentment later on, toward work that you now have to keep, towards freedom you no longer feel entitled to want, and towards a life that feels very full but not chosen. I've seen people reach financial independence and then realize, I don't know what I chose. I just followed the next step. That's not failure, but it is a missed conversation with yourself. One thing being gay has forced me to do, whether I wanted it or not, is to pause. There is no automatic script or societal expectation, no default, and this then happens. If we do want to have children, it has to be massively intentional. If we want a certain life, it has to be designed. And if we want purpose, we can't borrow it. And honestly, I think everyone benefits from that pause. Just long enough to ask, is this something I'm choosing, or something I'm hoping will choose meaning for me? Purpose isn't something you should rush to fill the silence with. The work is noticing why you're reaching for it. Because purpose that's chosen consciously will expand you. Purpose that's adopted by default, on the other side, will tend to box you in. And the best time to sort all of that out is before you quit, before the pressure lifts, and before life or work forces the decision for you. Quick pause. If this episode is sparking something for you, hit follow so you don't miss what's coming next. Feel free to share it with someone who'd love it too. It really helps the show to grow. So if you're exhausted right now and you're still grinding, still counting, and still telling yourself this is just a phase, I don't think you need a 5-year purpose plan. I don't think you need some big rebrand. I don't think you need to go and find your calling. And you absolutely do not need to know what the rest of your life will look like. That pressure to figure it all out is often the thing that's keeping you stuck in the position that you're in at the moment. What you actually need is something far smaller, far more achievable. Just one thing that makes today feel less like waiting and more like living. It's not necessarily something that's impressive. It's probably not something that's profitable. It's absolutely not optimized or future-proofed. It's just something that feels like yours. Something you'd still protect, even if the job stayed exactly the same, your timeline for retirement didn't move, or the number took longer than you hoped to achieve. For most people, that something shows up in one of 3 very ordinary ways. The first is movement. Doing something that puts you back in your body. An exercise class, a routine, a walk you don't rush through. This is why so many people in their late 30s and 40s suddenly sign up for high rocks and marathons and Ironmans, not because they all just suddenly love endurance sports, but because movement creates structure and progress and is something real to train for when work starts to feel empty. Those big events can be so powerful, but it's not the only way. Movement also might be a boot camp twice a week, deciding to lift weights regularly with a personal trainer, swimming with a friend, or just walking without turning it into a productivity task. The next one is creation, making something that exists outside of spreadsheets and performance reviews. This could be writing or recording, building or tinkering, or cooking even, chasing the perfect sourdough recipe, learning a new cuisine, and mastering a recipe just because it interests you. Creating things, even those tiny, ordinary, imperfect things, gives you forward motion that isn't tied to work, and that alone can make the grind feel lighter. The third thing is contribution, using your time, energy, or money to help someone you actually care about in a way that's real and immediate. The kind of help where you see the impact and not just plan for it. These 3 approaches don't lead to building new identities necessarily. They're not big life missions, but they are anchors. And if you're listening and thinking, but I don't have a big purpose at all, Well, I think that's normal. For most of us, purpose doesn't arrive as this North Star. I've said it again and again in this episode. It tends to show up after you've been living in a way that feels meaningful day to day. Meaning comes from the clarity that then builds between the edges, and then engagement comes before direction. During the wobblier part of my sabbatical, I procrastinated starting this podcast, something I'd wanted to do for years, to be honest. And I told myself it would be a waste of time, that no one would listen, and that it wouldn't go anywhere. But if I'm honest, what I was doing instead was watching Netflix, playing games, and cleaning the house. At some point, I had to laugh at myself. If I was already willing to waste time, why not waste it on something I was curious about? So I started recording, and without treating it like a life-defining project. And that made all the difference. It didn't give me a grand mission. It didn't answer every big question, but it gave me purpose today. And once I was engaged, once I was grounded, patterns started to form. Energy returned, and possibility opened up, maybe even the seeds of a future identity. So as a closing thought, maybe the real work isn't asking, what will my purpose be once I'm free? Maybe it's asking something much smaller and much more useful. What part of my life already feels worth keeping, and how do I expand that? Because as we've talked about today, purpose doesn't usually arrive as the grand revelation after you quit. It shows up quietly while you're still in it, in the things that make the grind feel lighter, in the moments that remind you you're more than your job, more than the next promotion, more than the next life milestone you're expected to want. If you can build that now, in the small imperfect ways, you don't just make the present more bearable, you make the future less frightening. Because you're no longer waiting for life to hand you meaning. You are choosing it. You're no longer waiting to become someone. You're already becoming. And that's how you get through the years before enough, without putting your life on hold. I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to Life After Enough, a podcast about money, meaning, and the life you design when work becomes optional. If this episode made you rethink your future, share it with someone who's starting to question the script too. You can follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Nick, and I'll see you next week as we keep building a life that's truly ours.